Sometimes they fight, you know? God. Get sat down here, get ready to go to work. All right. Everything look good? Yeah, it's a good shot. All right. Go. What up, Wizards? It's Dev. Mtg, we like it in Magic, and today I got a deck that's more fun than murder. Did I say murder? Or wait, what's that? Oh, that's it's good, is what that is. Jeez. There's going to be people in the comments section that say that's just ketchup. It is. It's just ketchup. As a matter of fact, you saw nothing. Don't worry about it. But you know what, y'all? The Meathook Massacre is one of my favorite cards to come out in like the last 5 years here. So I was really happy when the patrons ended up picking this to be the first deck of the season and not werewolves. Don't worry, I like werewolves. We'll get to them. But like everyone's first deck of the season was werewolves, right? You've seen it. You're sick of it by now. So I'm glad that we got to circumvent all the chumps talking about werewolves and talk about a card that I'm really excited about. I mean, look how awesome this card is. Werewolves are just a bunch of dogs. And in the end, this deck was so nice I made it twice. That's right, we're going back to the old days doing a double deck tag. It's been a minute since we did one of these, but I felt like it warranted it, you know? And in some color combinations I didn't expect either. I was really excited when I first started this project to get down and brew up some Orzhov Aristocrats like old times, man, and play some Flesh Taker because it's my favorite card. Not like in the set, it's my favorite card of all time. You've seen how awesome this card is, but in the end, I don't know that there are the tools for Orzhov Aristocrats, and maybe we'll get the proper pieces when Crimson Vow comes in. Here's hoping. But at this point, I'm just not sure how good Orzhov Aristocrats actually is, and it needs a little bit more synergy. That said, I decided to go Golgari next. Green-Black had some promising cards like Dina, for instance, and some other cool stuff, but that was also not good. It just wasn't a very good deck. But I ended up finding salvation in a couple of color combinations I, again, never would have thought. You know, Rakdos turned out to be great, which I guess isn't that weird, but Dimir also turned out to be probably the best of any of these builds that I tried, which really surprised me. So today I'm going to show you how to get the most meat out of your Massacre. Now first, let's go over the sort of basic package that both decks are playing, and I think the best way to do that is to talk about this card. Finally, I've just been throwing jokes and bits at you since this thing started, so let's actually talk about this card. Now first of all, both decks are playing all 4 copies of this. It's like a game of Dead by Daylight out there, like a really good slasher. I want as many hooks as I have access to, and yeah, I know that it's legendary, but I also don't care. I want to draw this as often as possible, whether early or late. It's good in both situations. You can drop it for 2 mana and just not kill anything. If that's how you want to play the card, then you just have like a Blood Artist, and that's what you want. But if you draw it late or you decide to play strategically and hold off for a couple of turns, you can kill a bunch of small dudes, and later on into the game, especially with the amount of treasure this deck generates, you end up being able to play Meathook Massacres for X equals 5, 6, and just really take out everything, and sometimes just win the game outright. There's other lines with this card too, as long as you have it on the battlefield, where you attack with all of your guys, get in whatever damage that you can, and then just sacrifice all of your dudes to one card or another and end up doing that last like 4 to 6 damage that you need to do to finish off your opponent. So in that way, this card lets you play like a very traditional sort of Aristocrats pile. One of the only really bad things about this card is that sometimes your opponent plays big creatures. I know, it's Magic. It's going to happen sometimes. And this actually does take a good amount of mana to take down bigger dudes. And it's right there on the card. That should be obvious, but it really sucks when you're staring down a pair of 5/5s or something, and you have a sweeper in your hand that doesn't quite kill the 5/5s, but it kills all your chump blockers. So it just kind of feels useless in those situations. But there are times where you can go into combat on your turn, hopefully make your opponent make some kind of bad blocks, and then once you've dealt some damage to them, you can more easily take out their big guys with a Massacre. Card also has this cool mode where it's just like not dead against control, like most sweepers would be. They just rot in your hand most of the game. But again, not dead against control, which I really respect. There's a lot of layers and like wrinkles to this card that I like a lot. But ultimately, it's a card that functions as a build around. When you play this card, you have to have a plan. So what is our plan? I should go ahead and let you know that both decks are playing all 4 copies of Shambling Gas, the perfect little carcass for all your hooking needs, which was not the way I intended for that to come out. But it is a perfect card for the deck, you know. Sometimes it even gets to attack, but for the most part, it's a perfect chump blocker, ramps you mana, and sometimes even kills smallish guys. And we want this card and others like it because this deck is mostly looking for either enter the battlefield value or dies value off of its creatures, because Massacre is going to come down and it's going to kill our guys. It's kind of part of the plan. So we want to get value when they die or have already gotten value when they entered the battlefield, like Acquisitions Expert. This card actually ended up in both decks, which really surprised me. Getting a card out of your opponent's hand is always better than you think it's going to be. Even if you just get a land, sometimes that messes them up for the entire game. And sometimes you play this in the mid-game and it takes out their last viable, awesome card in their hand. You feel really good about that. So, again, the card has just been, like, pretty strong for me so far. And sometimes you need a chump blocker. Sometimes you need a little guy to sacrifice, and you don't feel too bad sacrificing Expert. Because, again, you already got the value out of it. It's outlived its usefulness. You really have to be ruthless when you play a deck like this. Both decks also play some number of Skullport Merchant, because it's a really important card. It's a sacrifice outlet. Yeah, it does cost you a little bit of mana, but still, we need some sacrifice outlets in this deck. Pretty good one that also draws you cards. You'd be surprised how often you need gas in a deck like this, so really awesome mode on the card there, and it gives you a treasure token. And ramp is awesome in your Massacre deck. So even though, just like every other deck that it's ever been in, Skullport Merchant doesn't look like an optimal 3-drop, it's amazing how much this card actually does for you. Believe it or not, both decks also play the whole playset of Eye Twitch. Your eyes aren't twitching. That's 4 copies of the stupid card in both decks. And yes, these are best of 3 decks, but I still felt, in the end, like it was worth devoting just a few sideboard slots to a couple of lessons so we could get a cool dice trigger off of Eye Twitch. It's just such outstanding, sacrifice fodder that is also a really good chump block, and 2, contributes to the damage that you end up doing in a game. Even if Eye Twitch only flies over for a couple of damage before it starts blocking flyers, that's totally fine with me. You need to squeeze every little bit of damage that you can out of the game with these Aristocrats decks, and Eye Twitch helps you do that in the early turns in combat. There's a lot of awesome stuff about this card. Open your eyes. Puns. I know it's going to be hard to convince best of 3 players that this is worth it, but Eye Twitch is just one of the best black 1-drops in the entire format, regardless of whether or not you're playing with sideboards. It really is a stout card, but both decks also play 4 copies of Deadly Dispute, as you might imagine. Did I even have to tell you this? If I'd have skipped this card, you probably would have just assumed it was in the deck. Again, we need these sacrifice outlets as much as we can get them, and this one does everything. It gets you 2 cards, it ramps you in terms of mana, awesome to sack a Shambling Gas to it, and suddenly you got like 5 mana on turn 3, which is, again, pretty awesome for Meathook Massacre purposes. So, yeah, Deadly Dispute is in the deck. Now, I've effectively spent like 3 to 5 minutes describing the basic package that all of these like sacrifice and treasure decks play, but I think it is important to go ahead and hammer in the fact that both decks play all these cards, because they are really important. But now, the fun part. Let's get into why I think Rakdos and Dimir are the best ways to build a deck right now, and the specific things they're doing in their plan that make them that good. Now, I'll start with Rakdos, and probably the best thing that Rakdos gets that puts it head and shoulders above most other ways you can build this deck is Innistrad Predator. Now, since before this season even started, I've been trying to tell you how awesome this card's going to be in this format, and it's proven itself time and time again in the few days I've been able to test this deck out. It's just such an amazing card, and it might look a little weird with Meathook Massacre because Meathook Massacre gives -X, so it can kill this, even if this goes indestructible. But my counter to that is that as long as you have a few creatures on the battlefield, you can play your Meathook Massacre. While that triggers on the stack, you can sacrifice as many dudes as you need to sacrifice to get Innistrad Predator's toughness above whatever you chose for X, which happens an awful lot and leaves you with an enormous dude, and often the only dude on the battlefield. And it flies and can go indestructible if you play another creature. It's just absolutely ridiculous. And when you do have a Blood Sky, or a Blood Sky, when you have a Meathook Massacre on the table and an Innistrad Predator and a few creatures, you can get through for combat damage and then just use Innistrad Predator as a free sacrifice outlet. That way, you can potentially get in more flying damage in combat by sacrificing your creatures. And by sacrificing all of your whole team to an Innistrad Predator, you might just end the game thanks to Meathook Massacre triggers. So, the cards actually play much better together than it appears. Of course, for Rakdos, and we're looking for good things to sacrifice to Innistrad Predator, stuff with dice triggers, I think it would be a good idea to play 4 copies of Fireblade Charger. This effectively gives the Rakdos deck 12 1-drops, which I'm not even sure that it needs, but it does need a bunch of stuff to sacrifice to different effects. It needs a lot of bodies on the battlefield to make Meathook as good as possible in the long run. It needs, again, a lot of things to sack to Innistrad Predators, so 10 or 12 1-drops sounds about right, and Fireblade Charger is one of the best that we can play. Effectively, this not only will deal the damage when it dies because of the Meathook Massacre trigger, but it'll also deal at least 1 damage when it dies because of its dies trigger. So again, just a way to stack up damage really quickly. And even though it's not a serrated Scorpion, it's the next best thing. The Rakdos deck is also playing 3 copies of Burn Down the House. Now, this effectively gives us 7 sweepers that don't have to be sweepers. All 7 of them don't have to be sweepers. How liberating is that? Turns out very. If you're up against an aggro deck and you need to sweep the board 2 times in a game, you can do that pretty easily with this deck, and Burn Down the House picks up all kinds of huge guys at a relatively decent rate, and also blows up planeswalkers most of the time. But again, if you're against control and you just don't have a reason to use that mode, just make 3 guys. Make 3 Red Devils and then sacrifice them all to Innistrad Predator or play a Meathook Massacre. You end up getting to bolt the opponent. Or something else this allows you to do is play a Meathook Massacre and take down bigger guys, right? If you have 3 Red Devil creature tokens out, you play a Meathook Massacre and your opponent has a 6/6, it's pretty easy to kill that 6/6 with the Devil triggers when they die. So just a really cool card. If you need extra sweepers against aggro, you have 7 of them. 7 sweepers. But if you don't need sweepers at all, none of your cards have to be sweepers. That's awesome. Now let's go to the Dirty Dimir. Why is it so cool to play the Meathook Massacre in a blue-black deck? Now, you might think I'm going to say because Poppet Stitcher. But no, I know some people are doing this, but this version of the deck ended up being a little dirtly for me, and it just didn't feel like it was at the level of power that it needed to be. And Poppet Stitcher procs off of instants and sorceries. We actually need as many like bodies as possible. And yeah, you can play cards like Hunt for Specimens and Pest Summoning and stuff with this card and get a bunch of tokens. And it feels fun, but it doesn't necessarily feel good. It's a different thing. I think there's a lot of decks that can take out the Poppet Stitcher version of Dimir Meathook right now, but the version I came up with is a little bit different. It plays all those same cards that I said both decks play, but it also leverages Cyclone Summoner. Do you see? Do you see what we're doing here? It's actually a ridiculous thing to do. I mean, all of our, Skullport Merchants and Deadly Disputes and Shambling Gas, these all create mana for us. We often have 5 mana on turn 3 because of Shambling Gas, Deadly Dispute, right? So as long as we can make our land drops, we create mana very quickly. Why don't we have a huge ramp thing that we're trying to get to? And Cyclone Summoner is amazing for a bunch of reasons, right? The best thing about this card, in terms of this deck at least, is that this returns our Meathook Massacre to our hand, right? So, yeah, our opponent gets all their creatures back to their hand too, but usually opponents will spend the next turn just playing out whatever creatures you sent back to their hand with the Cyclone Summoner. So, next turn, when it's your time to go, you can just Meathook Massacre for like X equals 3 or 4, whatever you got mana for, and kill most of the things that they ended up playing. But you, my friend, have a 7/7, so you can get in for, I don't know, whatever his power toughness is after you play the Meathook Massacre. Maybe you get in first and then play the Meathook Massacre. It's really all up to you. It depends on what the line looks like in that situation. But Cyclone Summoner popping a Massacre back to your hand is brutal. But that's not all. The deck also plays Divide by Zero. Because why not? I mean, you can divide by 0 your own Meathook Massacre, and in that way, because of the Cyclone Summoners, which is technically a sweeper, and because of this sending the Meathook Massacre back to your hand, you kind of have even more sweepers than the Rakdos deck. I mean, if you want to count it, you have 8 sweepers if you count the Cyclone Summoner. And with the ability to bring the Meathook Massacre back to your hand, sometimes you'll be casting sweepers 3, 4, 5 times in a game, and it gets pretty ludicrous, but all you're really trying to do is lock the board state up and finish with your Cyclone Summoner, and the deck is surprisingly good at doing that. But of course, you don't have to use Divide by 0 on Meathook Massacre. You can use it on one of your own creatures and get the repeatable enter the battlefield value or whatever. You can play it on your Cyclone Summoner. Return that to your hand, cast it again, and get its ETB trigger. You can play it on one of your opponent's things if you need some sort of defense or tempo in the early game or mid game. You can just play it on a spell on the stack, send it back like it's got a hair in it, Like, there's a lot of amazing things Divide by 0 does. And just like iTwitch in the first deck, and in this deck for that matter, I do think that it's worth playing this card, even in best of 3, and devoting just a few sideboard slots to the lessons. And the Dimir version of the deck also plays a couple of copies of Infernal Grasp, because I was trying to find ways to fill the deck out. I'm not going to lie to you. And in the end, I was just like, yeah, some removal. One thing that's cool about this card in this deck, by the way, is that it interacts, quote-unquote, somewhat well with Meathook Massacre. If you have a Massacre out, You kill one of their guys, it effectively cuts the life that you have to pay in half. You just pay 1 life. Now again, these are best of 3 decks, and if you want to see the entire sideboards, I've got links to both deck lists in the description to the video. You can check them out there. But I at least want to talk, while we're here, about what lessons I ended up playing. I do think that you want Environmental Sciences and Mascot Exhibition, if nothing else. If you just want to devote 2 sideboard slots to lesson cards, I think these are the 2 that you need to play the most. Necrotic Fumes and Pest Summoning are also kind of on the docket, and if you want to play those, they're more than fine, especially in sacrifice decks. There are definitely uses for both of these cards, and Necrotic Fumes is especially very good some of the time. But again, if you want to free up as many sideboard slots as possible in best of 3, that's fine, but I suggest that you still play at least 1 Environmental Sciences and at least 1 Mascot Exhibition, if not more exhibitions, because this card is brutally powerful. Whether you need to get in for damage, or you need to get some chump blockers in the late game to hold your opponent off, or you just need some sacrifice fodder, Exhibition does it all out of your board, and that's a very powerful tool to have access to. So again, even in best of 3, I suggest you make some room for these. Now, interestingly, these decks' power rankings both worked out to be extremely similar, even though, again, their plans are similar, but the top end of their plans are very different. At one top end, we've got things like Burn Down the House and Innistrad Predator to take over the game, whereas in the other plan, we've got Cyclone Summoner, Divide by 0, do tricky stuff with Meathook Massacre, play it over and over. So again, the in-game plans of both decks look very different, but their scores ended up looking fairly similar. I mean, we don't play all the most powerful cards in the world, so it's about a 7. The defense is relatively high in both decks, although I think it's actually a smidge higher in the blue-black deck. That said, the consistency is slightly lower in the blue-black deck than it is in the red-black deck. The red-black deck has plans like Innistrad Predator. It has plans like Burn Down the House, whereas the blue-black deck is trying to do some really cute stuff, like Cyclone Summoner and Meathook Massacre. And even though it's a very powerful play, it is a little bit cuter than just Innistrad Predator eat your face. So I'm not really sure which deck is better, but I will say the blue-black deck is a little less consistent in terms of pulling off the Cyclone Summoner plan. Still a great deck. And the red-black deck has slightly less defense because it doesn't play things like Infernal Grasp or whatever. But that said, you still have 7 sweepers in that deck, so it's not so bad. But in the end, both decks scored a 67, which is a pretty commendable score at the end of the day. But that said, even if the deck had scored like a 49 or something like atrocious like that, I'd still be playing it for the rest of the season, because this is exactly the kind of deck that I hang my hat on, among other things. I mean, when I first saw Massacre, I couldn't wait to get my meat hooks in it and try to do some cool stuff, and I think we've definitely pulled that off. So give one or both of these decks a try if you possibly can. Links in the description to deck lists on TCG Player, which is the cheapest place you're going to get the deck on the whole internet. And I got to say this, Meathook Massacre is like $16 right now, something like that. So if you want to get your hooks on a whole play set of this, it'll cost you like $60 or a little bit more, which is a lot. But none of the other cards in the deck, either deck, are very expensive. Give either one of these a try if they seem cool to you. They are, I promise. And aside from that, do all the other stuff. Like, subscribe. There's tons of deck techs and other content coming out this season. You can check out the Twitch where we play some Magic. I play Magic on Twitch. If you ever want to see me do that, we have a lot of fun over there. You can check out our first VOD of the season. We did Blue-Red Thermo Alchemist. And I tilted a little bit. I know that I'm usually super chill, but I did tilt a little bit playing Blue-Red Alchemist, but I still had a lot of fun. I was mostly tilting for comedy purposes. But aside from that, you can check out the Patreon. $1 a month is all it takes to vote on decks. Did you want to see werewolves first? Well, if you had been a Patreon, you could have affected that vote. And there's going to be a bunch more polls this season. All it costs is $1 a month to get on the ground floor of those. So check me out on Patreon. Supports the channel a lot when you pledge that buck. Aside from that, follow me on Twitter. I say things on occasion. Maybe you'll see weird pictures that I post, or I'll just post like shower thoughts or weird stuff I'm thinking. You never know. You want to get in my head? Check me out on Twitter. I'll see y'all on the other side and catch you cats later. I am Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.